Aloha, my name is Sarah Henley Shepard. I am Director of Disaster Resilience LLC. It's a company that I started to do community resilience building here in Hawaii and internationally. I have a Master of Public Health focusing on international disaster relief, and then more recently I finished my PhD at UH in Natural Resource Environmental Management focusing on disaster resilience.
Great.
I'm working on both North Shore Kauai and North Shore Oahu on a Community Resilience Networks grant through NOAA. And I started as a volunteer in both communities about 4 years ago and built a lot of interests in community-based disaster preparedness. And so right now we're finishing up our disaster resilience plans. They're some of the first in the state, and we're doing so in a collaborative way with other grassroots groups throughout the state. That I've seen in the past 4 years as far as building interest in community resilience is just gaining volunteer momentum, recruiting volunteers and retaining them over time. There's a lot of movement of populations on the North Shore, and some of our strongest volunteers unfortunately have had to leave the area, and so you're constantly trying to re-educate, reinform, reinvigorate, and get that movement going again amongst volunteers. And so any grassroots movement is only as strong as its volunteer base. So in general, that's the biggest challenge.
Community.
The biggest challenges with the community groups is finding members that will consistently come to meetings and that are interested in helping their community. It seems that with all the groups, there's a very small number of very dedicated volunteers, but it's hard for a small number of people to get the work done that needs to be done by a larger number, really. It's hard to get the community together when only the same people are showing up every time.
Logistics, and I guess some of the challenges is it's not always, since we're all volunteers, we're not always available when something comes up. I may have a list of 50 volunteers, but when something happens, I'll send out an email and I get maybe 6. Because people have lives, they're off island, busy, kind of thing. So that's probably the main challenge.
It can be very easy and it can be very difficult. It really depends on the severity of the disaster, what I'm asking them to do. It's always easier gathering people after a disaster. It's not so easy getting them together in the planning stages. I would say that the greatest motivator for people to volunteer their time or give back to the community is seeing people suffering, seeing the aftermath of a disaster, and the devastation.
Personally, from what you've experienced, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, I don't know what
As boots on the ground at a disaster, what was that like?
When you first go to a disaster scene, it's very surreal. It's something that you only see in movies. And especially if there aren't any people around. And then when the people start coming, that's when it really hits you that it's real. This is someone's life. This is what someone was dealing with. And it's kind of like, wow, it really hits home. And then you try to do whatever you can in your Red Cross power or whatever capability that you have to kind of get them as close to normal or back to where they were as close as possible.
So if you can tell us about your community work and some of the stumbling blocks that you've seen communities have getting their organizations or their just grassroots efforts going.
I think generally in grassroots initiatives and community-based efforts, there's always the challenge of leadership, both time and capacity and relationships and networks that leadership may have. So a lot of communities that may identify a need to develop their own disaster preparedness group or plan may first need to identify its leaders, connect those leaders, and then certainly there's always issues with who do those leaders connect well with, and are there other groups that are disenfranchised or disconnected from those leaders and those networks that need to be engaged in an appropriate way. In addition to leadership is also longevity of planning. Resilience is an ongoing process as well as a goal, and so it's something that will require a lifetime of commitment, and that's not something that is really attractive to a lot of people who get burned out by meeting after meeting and workshop after workshop. So again, finding those folks that have the time to commit their expertise and their knowledge of community areas and issues and resources is critical, but realizing that you have to engage them in a way that won't burn them out and that really capitalizes on their skills and their interests. So engaging them in certain subcommittees or working groups where they feel they can contribute and they want to continue coming back to. Another issue is funding, which is always challenging. It's difficult for a lot of community-based groups to get funding. Certainly state civil defense and some of the counties have offered smaller grants through programs like Tsunami Ready and Storm Ready. But those programs run out of funds, and not all of the communities follow the same guidelines and find their own path, an organic path that really focuses on community-based values and ways forward. And so finding funding that will be adaptable and appropriate for each community's needs and interests is a challenge, but certainly can be done. So looking to alternative ways of fundraising, whether it's asking for donations or doing big fundraising events that also raise public awareness and increase education in the community and so forth are ways around this challenge. And I guess the final challenge is sharing of knowledge and sharing of resources. There's a lot of different groups that on the positive side are doing things their own way and using their own tools and methods and processes, but on the downside is there's a lot of time spent recreating tools and processes that maybe doesn't need to be spent. So what we're trying to do here in Hawaii is create this network so that we can all share openly our resources, our disaster plans, our tools, and so forth, so that people can pick and choose what they want to use and don't have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to make a community disaster plan. It's not something that's easy to do, and it's not something that is readily available online and so forth. So we're really looking at creating a forum for interaction and sharing so that a lot of these hurdles can be addressed in person and over time.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So, as you've been working on this, how have you seen disaster or resilience-related policies in Hawaii or laws change over time?
That's a great question. It's a really good time in Hawaii right now to be looking for resilience and disaster-related policies. One of the local grassroots disaster preparedness initiatives here on island, the Hau'ula Preparedness Committee or HELP Committee, they have worked to get legislation passed that basically enables folks to evacuate during a state of an emergency or a state of a disaster, and the private landowners would not be held liable for anything that happened on their property during that state of emergency or disaster. And that opened up a lot of literally locked gates and closed relationships, so that now a lot of folks in rural coastal communities are able to designate evacuation areas and get people out safe and sound. And in general, there's a cross-island community resilience network that's starting to form, and a lot of these grassroots groups are part of it, and we're watching policies very carefully, and as a group looking at what we could support and what will support our efforts in conjunction with all of our different stages of disaster preparedness. So there's some policies that have come out around resilience and also climate change adaptation. And the key is really connecting those different policies and efforts, and also getting a foot in the door as a community-based group. We're often left out of these larger task force that are very political, and we're starting to make a voice for ourselves so that we're included in those forums.
So do you feel that the state emergency management, and then I'll ask you about local emergency management in terms of government officials, have been helpful in the community resilience building effort? How and how not?
State civil defense is generally very supportive of community-based efforts, but skipping to your next question, it's really more the role and the capacity of the local civil defense or departments of emergency management to do a lot of the community level preparedness and outreach and making those kind of connections. So both State Civil Defense and City and County of Honolulu Department of Emergency Management and Kauai Civil Defense are very supportive of our efforts and integral to our planning process. They sit on our committees, they support our efforts, and they help inform our policies and programs to make sure that we are working in parallel and not in conflict.
So for the students in this class who are working on or who are interested in building resilience, what's missing? What can they help with in their communities?
Oh, it's a great question as far as what students can do to help communities that want to get engaged in disaster preparedness and resilience initiatives. In general, offering technical support, any kind of support that the community needs around raising awareness. Again, the issue of recruiting and retaining volunteers, doing a lot of public outreach, a lot of education is going to be a constant need for most community-based disaster preparedness initiatives. So offering any kind of support, whether it's physical labor or technical expertise, again, whether it's mapping or vulnerability analyses and so forth, a lot of communities have different needs because they have different values and different priorities. So being flexible to offer whatever skills and expertise that you have that fits with that community and that organization's capacity and interests is critical.
I would tell college students to come take one of the basic classes. Just get into an intro class. You'll learn the basics of what Red Cross does, and then from there you can find the area you like. And what I like to tell people when I teach classes is the first area you might jump into, you might not like it, don't quit. We'll find you a different area. There's so many areas to volunteer. Even in disaster services, that you could work with shelters or logistics or hotline operators. There's just a whole variety. If you like office work, there's office work. You know, we can find you something that you enjoy doing.
Weather Ready Nation. So we want people to be prepared first and then well informed second, to know when things are possible to happen, and when things do happen, they'll be prepared.
The best thing for college students or just for building resiliency is knowing how to be prepared yourself. If you're prepared, that's half the battle. Knowing what things are important in the event of a disaster and what things are probably really don't need to be that important. Preparing yourself, preparing your loved ones, knowing where to go is more than half the battle. And will save you a lot of time and headache if you have that thing. If you have that taken care of.
Is that you've collaborated with community groups or other agencies to help with disaster preparedness?
Right, the National Weather Service, as well as myself, we collaborate with many agencies across the government, as well as with, most importantly, with FEMA during our large disasters, as well as Fish and Wildlife, all of the NOAA agencies, and with the Red Cross, we do a lot of training and also interacting between all the agencies across the government.
Is it a lot of work to maintain these relationships?
Well, it's not the work, it's more of just getting the message out. Like when weather disasters happen, we want to have the most warning possible for people in the community, for government agencies to help the communities, as well as for just people in general to know, hey, there's rain coming, there's snow coming, trade winds in Hawaii, and those things going on. And as well as we have a lot of partners in the news agencies as well, with the TV broadcasters, newsprint, radio. We do a lot of active collaborations with those groups.
One of the newer groups that we're starting to work with here on the island of Oahu is Team Rubicon. Team Rubicon is veterans that have come together to do work in times of disaster, but they do more of a labor-intensive type of work. So that's stuff that Red Cross doesn't necessarily do. So it's a great partnership because when people are calling for help and it's something that doesn't fit within our realm of services, they're able to not necessarily pick up the slack, but step in and help out with the community.
What do you find is the greatest obstacle to working with other groups?
The greatest obstacle to working with other groups is just making sure that there aren't any duplications of services, so that we know who's feeding, who's sheltering. Well, really sheltering falls to us on the island of Oahu, but it's the feeding part and just making sure that we all have a good timeline and we all know when the other groups are doing